是个假娃娃，不是个真娃娃，他没有亲爱的爸爸，也没有妈妈。
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing the Ming and Qing dynasties in China in period 4 from 1450 to 1750. The big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is how did the Ming and Qing dynasty continue the traditions of China, and how do they deviate from those traditions? So if you'll recall, in period 3, after some more successful dynasties, the Tang and the Song dynasty, we had the Mongol invasion of China, and the Mongols established their own dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, in which they claimed the mandate of heaven. However, they did a certain amount of deviating of their own from Chinese traditions, like they ended the civil service exam system. Mongol women weren't as interested in foot binding. We have, after that, the collapse of the Yuan, the Khanate of the Great Khan, and we have the reestablishment of more traditional Chinese dynasties with the Ming. So following the Mongol rule, the Yuan, traditional Chinese practices are going to return to the Ming and Qing dynasty. So here you can see that the dynasties don't exactly line up with the periodization that has been selected by the College Board. So we have the Yuan dynasty in period 3, along with the Sui, the Tang, and the Song before that. And then we have the beginning of the Ming in period 3, and that would have included the treasure voyages of Zheng He, which we discussed in a previous video. And then we get into period 4, and we have the rest of the Ming, and we have the beginning of the Qing dynasty, and then the Qing go all the way through period 5, and then all the way into the very beginning of period 6. So the Ming dynasty are going to bring back a number of traditions to China. They did continue to utilize the bureaucracy, the existing bureaucratic systems that existed within China, but unlike the Mongols, they chose to keep that civil service exam system. So they also are bringing back the civil service exam system, which again is stressing kind of the teaching of Neo-Confucianism. The Neo-Confucianism is again that blending of traditional Confucian values plus some elements of Buddhism and Taoism. This also though means they're bringing back the patriarchy and traditional practices of foot binding, which again lasts in China from like 900 CE all the way up until like 1900 CE. The emperors in the Ming and the Qing dynasty are both going to claim the mandate of heaven, and as part of that, it's important to recognize that there was a certain expectation that rulers perform certain public rituals, oftentimes associated with Confucianism. And so this is expected for you to perform these certain rituals to honor and please the ancestors, and this is what in China allowed you as a ruler to legitimize your power, was the performance of these public Confucian rituals. Now the Ming and Qing's goal was ultimately to maintain stability over a large agrarian society. It's important to recognize that the vast majority of Chinese are still living not in cities, although the cities are increasingly growing in East Asia, but instead out in the countryside in small villages. There really was this continued emphasis on tradition in the Ming dynasty especially, right? We needed to get back to what worked for China in the past, but that ultimately may have stifled innovation. So if you recall, at the end of period 3, we had the treasure voyages of Zheng He under the Ming dynasty that were discontinued in favor of reprioritizing and ultimately constructing the Great Wall of China along the northern boundary. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because almost all of Chinese invasions came from the north. We had the Xiongnu in the classical age, and then in period 3 we had the Mongols, and so it makes sense that they would put some emphasis on guarding that boundary. And it really is during the Ming dynasty that they begin to construct the wall as we currently know the wall to be today with bricks. China, however, is ultimately, because of these decisions, they're going to cede maritime power to Europeans like the Portuguese, the Dutch, who are increasingly coming over into the Indian Ocean and into the South China Sea, and they're coming to trade with China. Now remember, China is demanding something from Europe in the form of silver, and so we're going to see Europe increasingly though making advancements in maritime technology. So the reasons for the Ming Dynasty are going to collapse in the middle of the 1600s, and the primary reason is because of the weather. It's actually really cold in the 1600s, generally speaking. This is the period, the kind of peak of the Little Ice Age, which lasted again from about 1350, so really the beginning of the plague is when we first talked about the Little Ice Age, to this is really the peak of the Little Ice Age, the fall of the Ming Dynasty in about mid 1600s, and then it lasts all the way up until about the 1800s. So famine is going to be widespread as China's population is increasingly growing because of access to American foods. They're population is going to exceed their resources, their food resources. This is going to lead to famine, and ultimately is going to lead to food riots, as lower class people who are hungry are going to see the Ming as having lost the mandate of heaven. So this is ultimately an internal factor for imperial collapse, but we also oftentimes talk about those external factors. And in the case of the Ming, it was an external quasi-nomadic group from the north, the Manchurians, who crossed over the Great Wall of China and who invaded northern China. And so the Manchus, or the Manchurians, are going to rule China during the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing, who are really the Manchus, from 1644 until 1911. So a little bit of the end of period 4, all of period 5, and then into period 6. Now the Manchus are going to expand the boundaries of China. They're going to conquer this region over here, west in Tibet, a very Buddhist society and culture that oftentimes has certain cultural traditions that are distinct from China. And so many people of Tibet today still are seeking their independence from China. And then also conquering Mongolia up here. So the expanded boundaries, which begins to form kind of the modern Chinese state by the Manchus in the Qing Dynasty. Now the Manchus are going to maintain the bureaucracy, much like the Mongols had done before that, the Yuan, when they ruled China, but they're really going to exploit ethnic divisions. So whenever you're dealing with a empire who is a minority ethnicity ruling over a majority of people, in this case the Chinese, who are of a different ethnicity, it's really important that you put in place certain laws, rules that are going to allow you to maintain your supremacy. And the way they did this in China was they required, the Qing did, Chinese men to wear a certain hairstyle, Q hairstyle, short in the front and a very long ponytail in the back. And this was really seen as a sign of submission. Now you may have seen this on cartoons from the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s that feature anti-Chinese sentiment, racist attitudes toward Chinese. Now the other way you do this is you prevent intermarriage. So the Chinese men were not allowed to marry Manchu women or vice versa. So there was no intermarriage between Manchus and Chinese that was allowed. And again, that is also something that the Mongols did in order to maintain that sort of ethnic superiority and identity. Now, in terms of Chinese culture, we can see, as evidenced by this image, the spread of Christianity. Here you see Mary and Jesus. So Christianity, however, was ultimately slow to spread to China. But as a result of increased contacts with Europeans are establishing diasporic communities in China. Christianity, though, is slow to spread, mainly because there are already two deeply rooted both religious traditions and ideological traditions in China, which were Buddhism and Confucianism. These Jesuit missionaries, though, who were sent over to China, had achieved some success, but ultimately were expelled from China after the Pope is going to claim authority over basically all Catholics worldwide. And this is going to obviously upset the Chinese emperor, who's going to be like, wait a second. I'm the emperor of China. I control all Chinese regardless if they're Catholic or not. And so this dispute ends up with the Chinese emperor expelling Jesuit missionaries. And we're going to see this also played out similarly in Japan. Both China and Japan are going to increasingly turn towards more isolationist policies towards the end of period 4 and then into period 5. So the big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is, how did the Ming and Qing dynasty continue the traditions of China, and how did they deviate from those traditions? Thanks for watching.